Hello, dear ones. Welcome to another conversation on the different shades and shapes of love. The kind of conversation I think we must have more of. As always, before we start, can I invite you to take a moment of centering and breathing with me so we take a pause together. Sit down with your back up. Drop your shoulders. Relax. Close your eyes. Breathe. Inhale deeply. Exhale slowly. Inhale deeply. Exhale slowly. Inhale deeply. Exhale slowly. And when you're ready, gently open your eyes. And now listen with your heart. Today's shade of love is rice. Rice was the love I received in the form of gallons of confidence from a meteoric trajectory in my professional journey. I was promoted every year while in corporate banking, then known as credit and marketing. But counting the number of years, 20, that it would get me to reach the top of the organizational structure to be the CEO did not sit well with this young upstart. I heeded that glorious fire in my belly and the nagging tug of the travel bug and joined an international conference group. Ma was upset that I chose to leave banking for a sector which I could not even describe to her adequately in Hokkien or Mandarin. Still, I became a general manager at 24 and the managing director of its Jakarta office at 25. Then I went on to work in Sydney with the group CEO to launch a new financial training business. Being an integral part of the joint venture negotiation with the New York Stock Exchange that founded the New York Institute of Finance, I became its first Asia Pacific managing director at 28. Later on, I became part of Pearson PLC with its acquisition of the New York Institute of Finance, rubbed shoulders with leaders of the Financial Times, The Economist, Longman, Penguin, amongst others during management retreats in the UK. I achieved all of this before I reached 32. It was a fast and furious yet completely unplanned professional journey. I just showed up with curiosity, topped with an excess of masculine drive. So it seemed like success to me and many people. Wow. What sweet success indeed for a young woman who was given stop as part of her name and constantly reminded she was slow as a young girl. This incredible opportunity of scaling such saccharine heights made the tualang tree a perfect choice to pair with for this shade of love. Relatively fast-growing, tualang is amongst the tallest tropical trees in the world. Mature ones can rise above the rainforest canopy to become the monarchs of the forest. The Malay name tualang means tree of swarming bees because giant honeybees build their nest high up on the trees, out of the reach of animals and humans. And when I was thinking of who I would like to have a conversation with on this shade of love on success and social acceptance, a friend whom I'm a big fan of was my first thought, because the choices he made as a young adult could not have been more different from mine. Prior to that, we would have been seen as following a trajectory that would make all Singaporean parents proud. We both went to neighbourhood primary schools, moved on to top schools, and then landed at the National University of Singapore. I finished business school and started my career as a young banker. But this friend, Alfian Sa'at, who's more than a few years younger than me, attended medical school but chose to take a road less traveled that led him to become one of Singapore's most acclaimed and prolific artists. Alfian is a writer, poet, and playwright, and currently the resident playwright for theatre group WildRice. Hello, Alfian.
Hello, Anthea. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much for bravely saying yes to being part of this podcast experiment to discuss love and I think to call on love more, right? As we look at pressing issues of our time.
Sure.
Coming back to, this story, right? This shade. So being a banker wasn't actually my first choice.
Sure.
But it paid more than the other jobs, at the time when my dad was jobless. Compared to copywriting, actually, in an advertising agency, which clearly was what I thought I would have liked to do at the time. But yet I did excel and it was considered by most as being successful. The first time I actually questioned that path was when I hit the pinnacle of my corporate career, of that journey, because as the most senior within the organization.
And that's quite a meteoric CV you have there.
Thank you. But only then did I ask,
right,
what then? What's next? Was it just going to be another, higher, bigger paycheck next year? Another title, but basically the role is the same, just maybe a larger geographical responsibility.
Right.
So the reason I'm bringing it up is that how sure were you, when you made that choice to pursue a life as an artist?
Yeah.
What made you do it, I think? And what were you answering to?
As you know, I went to medical school, right? In National University. And what was interesting for me was that I always assume, this is the kind of course of study where you kind of download all this knowledge into your head. And there was a part of that kind of learning which didn't really excite me because I wanted to think of education as something where you produce knowledge, rather than to kind of plug in a USB and kind of like, okay, this is the anatomy textbook. This is all the stuff that people have figured out way before you have, and
100 years actually.
Exactly. You have to imbibe it for your own foundation, and only later on maybe you can do your own, clinical investigations and diagnosis on your own. But you have to start here. So I think I assumed that was the kind of knowledge absorption that I would have to do, in the course. But I remember one day I was in a lecture theatre and they were showing slides that have got to do with embryology, which is basically how the embryo is formed. And they showed all these various layers and how those cells could multiply and suddenly, diversify into all these things. And I remember that the person who made those slides, apparently he was quite legendary in that faculty for these really beautiful images that he creates out of plasticine. To show,
really?
Wow. How the human body was formed. And I remember quite distinctly, I was sitting next to someone, another medical student, and when he saw these slides, he just sighed, right? And then I recognized that's how I would respond if I were to read a really beautiful poem. And then I realized that,
you're not sighing.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not sighing at all. I'm like, where did he get the plasticine? And how come so many nice colors? Did he mix some of the colors by himself?
Right.
Yeah. So I was thinking more about how he made that. But to my friend, obviously there was a certain beauty, a certain elegance, a certain poetry even, right, to this. And I think at that point of time, it just struck me I'm shortchanging myself if I'm not sighing like this guy, right?
Wow.
Yeah, if I'm not really in awe,
or moved
of this,
and
or
stirred,
moved, absolutely, And then I knew at that point of time what was going to stir me, and it was not going to be beautiful plasticine slides of the human anatomy. I mean, and I'm not saying it in a mocking way at all, but obviously this turns on some people.
Yeah.
It does not turn me on. And I think it's very, very important to recognize that, right? It's a kind of inner sounding. What is it that resonates with you? What is it that can, as you mentioned, stir you, make your hair stand, And I'm sure we've experienced this, right? When we have an epiphany, when a certain door to a new knowledge opens up, inside of us. For me, I can literally feel, as I mentioned just now, my hair stand. The sense that
No, same.
I've discovered something new. This has somehow, let the scales drop from my eyes. I'm seeing things, in completely different way. And it can be anything.
Yeah.
It does not have to be art or literature.
Of course,
it can be anything.
Actually, I feel that often when I'm out amongst the mountains.
Right, yes.
In the forest.
Absolutely,
seeing a new plant or a flower that I've never seen before.
Right,
And I totally know what, and I'm feeling it now. I'm feeling this expansion in my chest.
Yes.
As we're talking about this, that expansiveness and there's also some deep joy that comes from it.
Absolutely,
right?
In fact, I think
feels the aliveness also that comes.
Absolutely, from that. Yeah. So when you mention joy, it is that, I feel. I think one of the joys in our lives is actually encountering all this knowledge that reshapes the way we think of the world, our place in the world.
I love that. I love that a lot. Although that definitely didn't call on me when I decided to be a banker. It was all, let's just help Papa out.
Sure. No. And I think, we shouldn't feel any lesser or whether we make all these decisions based on what we think is a bit more pragmatic kind of reasons and all that. We all have.
I actually really enjoyed my time.
Right.
And I think that that's also why I kind of said that, because there was still curiosity that I showed up with. And I don't think I was stirred. I definitely wasn't stirred that way.
Yeah.
But I definitely felt, that, wow, this is so interesting. I was curious and all. And I think that had a part to do with the rice.
Right.
I think. I mean, that's my own theory. Okay,
Right.
but what was it like though for your family and friends?
Yep. Yes. Yeah. So
because you step off this, to most people, almost like a brightly lit highway to a future that is known and endorsed and accepted, right, by society. I mean, you almost as if I imagine it, right, visually I'm thinking, you just step off the highway and took this country road.
Right. Yeah.
Side road.
Yeah.
How did they
So I come from a quite a working class family, right? And my mother, she was a factory worker, and she used to work in a typewriter repair factory.
Oh.
Yeah, and I remember after 10 years of long service or something, she managed to. She was awarded with a typewriter. She brought it home. I couldn't stop playing with it. And she blames that for me wanting to be a writer.
That is so cute. What a story. I love that.
Yeah. And my father was a policeman with the Port Singapore Authority, so customs policeman. So I did come from a very, very working class family. So when people say, to be an artist, you need to come from a middle class family.
That privilege.
Privilege, yeah.
Yeah.
I think we need to question that also, right? Because I think it's also important for people from working class backgrounds to go into the arts. Because your lived experiences, it needs, we don't want the arts to just be only reflecting middle class concerns, right? And middle class backgrounds. I think we really, really need that kind of diversity. So I think. So it was this thing, right? So on one hand, I was thinking, as someone from the working class, and you grow up in Singapore, you always think, with every subsequent generation, right? You kind of need to want to move from the working class to the middle class, and but I also had two
We call
sisters.
it social mobility.
Social mobility, that's right. Social upward mobility, right?
Upward mobility.
But I had a sister, I suppose, and I think this is the thing where I feel like I owe her a lot as as a sibling, because I feel that because she was working as a teacher, for example, that gave me a little bit of freedom. So she supported my parents until I was able to be, financially stable myself to support them. Yeah. So I think that kind of a family support allowed me, I think, to pursue, a not very remunerative career, at least in its early stages, right?
Early days, yeah.
As I was still trying to find my feet there. But looking back, I do think the fact that I came from a working class background, it was absolutely crucial for me to go into the arts, and therefore to try to bring those experiences and those narratives into my writing. So when I was writing Malay sketches, for example, there's really quite a bit there about my own parents, for example,
right.
And also quite a few working class characters. So I feel confident writing these characters, and I know people are gonna look at me like, hey, you RI boy, right? Or
yeah, that's
or
true.
just listen to the way you talk. You sure you're not middle class and all that, but I did come from a working class family, and I was exposed to a lot of working class anxieties, right? And even things about
what we call bread and butter issues,
right? Yeah, but also these kinds of yearnings also when you grow up in a family which you compare to your friends and you don't have as much and also the image that you have for yourself. So I remember my father, he had a really beat up second, third hand kind of car. And when I was studying in the RI, I would always say, you don't have to drive into the school. Just, drop me off. Yeah. At the bus stop outside. And I'm sure, I think, my father figured out why I wanted him to do that, but nevertheless acceded to my request. But I think if I had not come from that kind of background, I would not have this kind of experience. So I look back, of course, feeling like, my God, I was so juvenile. Why?
We all went through that,
right? Yeah. Why did I think that
the
esteem of my peers was the most important thing than to actually appreciate the fact that my father was going out of his way to send me to school. I mean, that was the more important thing, right? But I remember, feeling all these, why? Resentful of parents because they didn't seem to be able to give me the things that my friends' parents were able to, So
and in fact, this was something that we were just talking about earlier. That I went through that as well, right? I remember very vividly, wanting my mom to be able to speak English, all the moms of my friends, particularly in university, because sort of when you are hanging out with a social group that comes from a certain social class, right? You start, and of course, then I was a little ashamed, that my family is not English speaking. Both parents are not the same sort of university grads like my friends' parents and all of that. But actually, I'm so glad that I have the parents that I have.
Right, of course, yeah.
And also realizing, not so long later, that actually was never about whether they could be educated or well educated. It actually came down to the opportunities and the access they had.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
But I think because of the peer pressure and because of what society expects of us, and in certain schools like the ones that I guess you and I went to,
right?
Sort of surrounding us, there's a certain sort of there's a predominant social class that we are part of. So I think those pressures definitely came, but I don't think any of us should feel guilty about feeling a little resentful when we're young and restless and
But what you mentioned just now, I think does fit into today's topic, right? Which is how do we measure success?
That's right.
And I do feel, I think it needs to be said that even though, so my parents were the product of Malay schools. So they went to Sang Nila Secondary School. Yeah. So there were two, right? So there's Sang Nila Utama Secondary School and Tun Sri Lanang. So recently a book has been published by Hidayah Amin about those two last Singapore Malay vernacular schools.
Sang Nila was the one at Upper Alternate Road. But during that time, maybe not.
Right. Yeah. So my parents were from that school, and so it was that particular point of time in history. So we were part of the Federation of Malaysia.
Right,
So there's this
yes.
idea that, Malay is national language. And if you went to Malay vernacular schools, you're going to have a bright future. Then separation happened, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So I do believe like my parents are very intelligent people. They did very well in their school. But because English then became ascendant, then they became, gradually quite marginalized because of their lack of English proficiency. And I just want to say also that I know that this narrative is also shared by, let's say, people who went through the Chinese vernacular school system. Yeah.
The whole Nanta.
Nanta, absolutely, right? Yeah. And so I think it's important to bear those things in mind as well, to see that English education is not the only marker of intelligence.
Yes.
To also see that educational qualifications or attainment are also not a marker of your value as a human being, right? And I think it's easy when I was younger to look at my parents and think, oh my God, you're not educated, or don't embarrass me speaking English in public to people, you're mispronouncing things and all. But over time, I have looked at how resilient and creative and my working class parents have been, and I think that's important also. I mean, my mom.
That's a really powerful. That's a very powerful shift in perspective, right? To not forget that a language, could actually, if seen as the predominant one for society, should not be the marker of success. Absolutely. Or the way you define success just because of your proficiency in it.
Yep.
But it, obviously, this is something that I think, again, it's a really long conversation if I want to go into that, but I want to bring us back to talking a little bit about the arts.
Yes.
If I may.
Sure.
I actually, remember being rather good in painting in my lower secondary days.
Yeah.
I even remember especially still life. Do you remember still life?
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, so my works were often displayed. But when it came to choosing the stream for my secondary 3, right? It was almost a no-brainer. I mean, obviously, my mom, doesn't really get involved with the choices I made. Dad was obviously clearly asking me to go to science stream. All the teachers around me said the same thing. I don't even think not that I even resisted. I don't think that it was even something I thought about because of my sterling grades, right?
Right.
So
okay.
Kind of like if you're smart, I mean, you get good grades, then of course you should go to.
It's so overdetermined, isn't
I know,
it?
right?
If you did really well, then go to the most difficult course because you qualified for that. I thought the same way.
I really didn't even think of anything else. Is what I said. What I'm recalling now, right? As I'm speaking with you. So now we all know that other than our founding Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, who famously said to a room full of students, right, at University of Singapore in 1968, and incidentally, that's when I was born. That's the year I was born, right? He said something like, "Poetry is a luxury you cannot afford," right? So I want us to have a discussion about what about arts, right, makes it such a inexpedient choice, and what now as an artist, and you make this, your life trajectory. What are the biggest myths about the arts that you want to debunk here?
Yeah. Wow. So I think maybe I will refer to an infographic that came out. When we were in the early stages of this COVID. Yes. And so newspaper decided, or not a newspaper, I think it was a survey kind of firm, right? They went around asking people what they thought were the least essential jobs in Singapore. And number one was artists.
Yeah.
But what I found interesting was what they used as the graphic for that artist. And it's basically, did you notice that?
No.
Huh? Okay.
That's why you see me like, I'm trying to recall now actually, as you're saying it.
What do we think of when we think of an artist? I think that's a question that, I would like to us, many Singaporeans, because when they say, I don't understand art, or, artists are just people who want to get attention, or, just
Or
want
for the well-heeled is the most common saying.
Right,
Right?
yeah.
Arts is for the well-heeled.
Exactly,
and
right?
privileged.
So,
and, yeah.
absolutely. And it's interesting for me because like that graphic, I felt like perpetuated stereotypes of
What was
what
the
an
graphic
artist
again?
was. So the graphic was someone who had a beret, right?
Oh,
like a French
right,
beret,
a French beret,
right?
and if artist by the river.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So if I'm not wrong, even like a mustache and like holding a paintbrush or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think, I mean, if that is the impression
That's
of,
right.
of then
Really good
obviously
point.
you're wondering, okay, someone who's a painter. But I also do think painters are important, right?
Yeah.
But I think it's also about what do people think of when they hear the word artist? Because there's so many artists doing a whole range of activities, right? So there's applied arts, which is basically like design and architecture, right? And I think those things are really visible to all of us. In everything that we do. Look at the glass you're holding, look at your bag. I mean, someone designed it, right? Absolutely. Fashion and design, product design, architecture, and all that, applied arts. That's also the fine arts, which I guess is a little bit of a more difficult argument to make. But still, I think really, really no less essential. Yeah. So, yeah.
How did we come to that though? I'm so fascinated that you talked about that icon or that representation, right, in that survey, or at least in the way it was presented, right, on mainstream media about what artists do. That beret. Yeah. I don't recall it, but I can just imagine it would be used, right? How did you think come to this? I mean,
where did that stereotype come from, right?
Yeah.
I do think, unfortunately, the media in Singapore has been responsible for, let's say, like sensationalizing a few things that artists have done for the sake of eyeballs, for the sake of controversy. But I think what that has resulted in is, I mean, they have a role in public education, right? They really have a role in trying to make the public kind of like appreciate and understand the arts. But I'll give you a couple of examples. So when performance artist Joseph Ng snipped his pubic hair, and that became front page news for the newspaper, and they thought it was so funny because they had this pun about like public protest, but they put the L in brackets, so it's like pubic protest.
Oh, that's right. Now
roll
I recall.
eyes, yes.
Yeah, roll eyes.
Yeah. So when you have that, and then there is no context or very little context within the piece trying to explain why he's doing this, which is basically to protest the Fort Road arrest, right?
Yes.
In 1993. And then after that, when there's another article about how Vincent Liao, this artist, was drinking his own urine, for example. So I think when you have those kinds of news reports about what artists do, and then it seems as if, my gosh, and you sensationalize it, and it seems like, what are they trying to do? I don't understand. And the most recently, for example, Amanda Heng has this project at the Singapore Art Museum where I think she's asking like members of the public to take photographs of their posterior, right? The women, and then people are like, what is this? The pornography, but I see that as an opportunity for dialogue, right? It might unsettle you, might disturb you, and obviously you're entitled to your view, but are you also open to listening to other views, right? And listening from the artist herself, right? I think it makes a difference that this is done by a woman and not a man. It makes a difference also that she's asking women to take photographs by themselves rather than, so it's not another person's objectifying gaze of them. So I think, once you go a little bit deeper, and once you get over the initial shock of like, how come butts are now art, right? which I think is like the yeah, exactly, right? Why not? Like, have you seen those like Grecian Roman statues lately?
Well, exactly.
And of course this is the whole idea of like nudity and art. I mean, it's a whole long history and a whole long discussion, right?
That's true.
Because not everything that's naked is to be sexualized.
Yeah.
So
And actually, if the general narrative of art is it's actually painting or painter, and then and you're talking, and because if that's how they see art, then they're gonna lump everything, and they will bring the media and the general public will just bring all this all these art forms that you just talked about, that's visual, into that whole corner of. No, it's not about us.
Yeah, that's right.
There's no relatability. I don't understand.
Or my son my 5-year-old son can draw better because it's like what crayon and So
exactly.
Actually, I do feel like yes, a lot of works that are considered abstract or a bit more difficult. I mean, maybe that's not the kind of stuff that's for you, but that doesn't mean that the entirety of what is art is something that is irrelevant to you. I mean, you will find something that you like, and I do feel that for some people, maybe their encounter is they see like an amateur production and then very earnest secondary school kids, doing physical theatre and like interpretive dance or something like that, and then they're like, oh my god, I have like goosebumps seeing these things because like why are they doing these strange things, But also, I mean, that's not necessarily good art also, right?
Right.
And sometimes, there's stuff right? Like interpretive dance or sometimes like really kind of like a bit kishy stuff and all that. That's not necessarily what's the best out there on offer, And if those are the few kind of like limited things that you see,
that you're exposed to,
and sometimes a bit of performance art is also a bit short sendiri as well, a bit indulgent, and I think we recognize that, and we're not saying that, as long as it's art, if you don't get it, you don't have a soul. So we're not saying that, right? So I think it's important to not dismiss that, and also this stereotype of the artist that is somehow like apart from society.
That's actually what I was gonna get into. That's right. That segregation.
Yeah.
Right.
Because apparently, how come this person can do this kind of thing? This means that, this person is on the fringe or not one of us, a person who doesn't understand how the rest of us think, and is an outsider. But I also want to say that actually, I mean, I take public transport, I pay taxes, I went to NS, I am part of society. So many artists are, and in fact, a lot of their artworks are based on what they have drawn from society.
That's right.
Which they then use to reflect back to society, so art is never created in a vacuum. And I always feel like the best plays are the ones that draw immediately from their society and, as I mentioned, reflects it back. And that's why I don't think a lot of plays really travel so well.
Right.
Because they are
very
from that community, right? And it's played back to that community.
And the sad thing is that when it's actually supposed to be from the community to play back the community, and yet a large part of the community and society doesn't relate to it.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So I do think there's a whole spectrum.
Yes,
also,
of course.
Of
course.
So there might be like
important.
works that are a bit more. So if I'm talking about plays, right?
Yeah.
So the ones that
especially
maybe
the forum theatres.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the ones that are more realistic might land, with like maybe first time theatre goers. But of course, I mean, I concede that there's a whole spectrum of like something a bit more stylized and abstract, and there's so much a lot more realistic, and there's narrative, there's drama. Okay, these are the ones that are not so different from movies, I suppose, and therefore might have a much wider appeal. Yeah.
Do you think because of that now there's a shift in the definition of success when it comes to, those of you who are actually pursuing this?
Actually, I think like being in the arts has made me really think about what success means, right? Because I don't think there's a very clear career trajectory. Maybe there are, if you're looking at arts as this idea of being a professional artist. So let's say if you're a visual artist, maybe you're represented by a gallerist, for example, and that represents, and then your works fetch high prices in the art market or something like that, right? Yeah.
That could be one marker.
That could be, one marker. But I also feel that increasingly, I see a lot of artists who see the value in deprofessionalizing, right? So even though they have they have reached like, let's say, a certain level of artistic excellence
and recognition as well. Okay.
But at the same time, they also feel it's a bit of a trap, because then you get on this, let's say, a production treadmill. Let's say, for example, a theatre company gets a major company grant by National Arts Council. That's going to be seen as, oh, you have arrived, because, some of us are independent theatre artists. We're still struggling. We're trying to get funding. So you have a major grant. Wow, that's like funding for the next 3 years. But it comes with these conditions about like, oh, you have to produce a season of like 4 or 5 plays, a year. And then you're doing like one production after another, and then you're realizing, oh, I don't actually have time to watch the works of my peers. I'm so every time in the rehearsal room producing. So I think it's important also, I think, for some people to like, oh, but is this really what art making should be about? Is it about producing? Is it about selling products? And then also, I suppose, questions of like, then I specialize, right? And then when I do a play, I need someone who's a lighting designer, sound designer, but why can't I do it? Why can't we have generalists?
Right.
Why are we looking at that? And then all that adds up to the cost of a production, and then you tend to sort of like overproduce because the budget needs this and this and that. Yeah? So I think when I say deprofessionalize, I don't see it as necessarily something that affects the quality of the work itself.
Right.
But basically in how is it that you then decide the process of making this work. Do we need people who are all these specialists on board? Can we work with people with little or no experience? Do we need multimedia? Do we what can we actually create with really the simplest, with an economy of means? So
if I was to play devil's advocate, then I would ask, if we go down the path of deprofessionalizing, which I can see the merit in it, because it's going to be sort of owning the creative process, in a sort of a larger spectrum. But at the same time, if one was to say, oh, but if you want to, give opportunities for the young ones who want to pursue arts, or want to go into the arts sector, then you kind of have to have this, opportunities for them to be able to make a decent living.
Yes.
So then that would be that tension point that comes in. But it's really interesting. This is the first time I'm hearing, this term of deprofessionalizing, and I can actually resonate with that. I feel like then it is about making art.
Yeah, and I always feel that as an artist, I think the minute you feel that you have so-called arrived. So I think I mentioned in an earlier discussion the word success also for me. There's also the word stasis there. And I think it's important to guard against that feeling that, oh, I've reached a certain destination, right? Because then how then do you grow? And to grow, I think you need to be thrown into situations or an environment where you feel challenged,
uncomfortable.
And uncomfortable, absolutely, where you become an amateur again. And this is what I mean, I suppose, by deprofessionalizing. That sense of like, oh gosh, I really have to learn the game from the beginning. And I think there was a little bit of that when we had to shift to doing like stuff in the digital realm. Suddenly we were all like amateurs again, because like we're so used to doing live theatre, and now we are like, oh my god, you mean we are supposed to make theatre on Zoom? Like, a platform that is for teleconferencing, but how do we do this? And I found like a lot of us were challenged, but I think in a good way, because
And I like that perspective. In fact, that was what I was going to ask, right? About how do we now define success, both you and I, right? So you just shared, and it's very, very similar to how I see success. I feel like we've been duped somehow. We always been told about success being the opposite of failure.
All right.
Right? We're always
Wow.
been taught to think about success as a destination, as an event,
Yeah.
as a place that we get to. And I mentioned earlier about how when I got the pinnacle, right, in the corporate world, as the most senior person,
Yeah.
and I was just all of 32. My life is just starting. And then what then?
Mm.
And that's when I think you talked about the growth,
Yeah.
right? Not being challenged and all, which I then, of course, challenged myself and went to start my own company.
Yeah.
So I think, and I really like what you said about how when you are already so used and you become an expert in it, you no longer are uncomfortable.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And it reminds me of this Zen philosophy that says that as an expert, there are few possibilities, but with a beginner's mind, the possibilities are infinite.
Right.
And I think with that comes that growth that,
yeah.
again, is so much part of our human longing, right? Our
yes.
deep longing of growth, of becoming alive, of just feeling that stirring.
Yes. So,
again.
I mean, if I may, it's
Yes.
just reminded me this quote by Ko Pao Kun, right? And it was on the wall of the SEP station for a long time. And I don't know whether I'm quoting it verbatim, but it's something like a worthy failure is more important than a mediocre success, right? Yeah. And I think
So
that's also something we really should pay attention to, like what the things that we define as failure in our lives, right?
Yeah.
Because actually, what is failure? I don't think we've given it. Yeah, it seems as if it's something to be ashamed of. It's something to expunge from our records, right? But I really look forward to. I was imagining actually one day to a panel with some arts practitioners and to discuss this whole question of what do you think is your biggest failure?
Oh,
Yeah.
Alfian, can I just say something? I just had the chills, and
Okay.
and I know that we're going, deeper into the conversation.
Okay, right.
It's so interesting because when you were saying, what is failure, right? From is that the right way to call failure?
Right.
I call it growth, and actually, that's how I've actually shifted in how I've, first of all, picked myself up when I was in that major collapse, right? 15 years ago.
Yeah.
Where I lost everything that I thought defined me, right? And then I realized that no, actually, those didn't define me. It was actually the failures, in quotation marks, that defined me because that's what made me grow.
Right.
So I'd say that we would actually redefine failure as growth markers, right?
Yes.
They are growth markers.
Yeah.
Last question.
Yep.
Your tips for our listeners out there, especially the young ones,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
You had obviously written a very different story for yourself. That's been a departure from what many, I think, are expected, especially the young ones who have actually come to me and said there's a certain expectation, they have to go a certain pathway, and that often create a lot of conflict, right, for them, and it's also a big part of our youth mental health challenge that we're dealing with. What would you say to the young ones out there? But actually, not just one young ones. Like any of us can still, try to write a script. What tips would you give?
So I think a long time ago, both Colin Goh and Wu Yan, I think they wrote a really amazing essay looking at this idea of the Singapore dream.
That's right. I remember that.
And they contrasted it with actually in Singapore, it's not really about dreaming, it's about planning. Right? So it's more the Singapore plan. Like what plans do you have? And even I know some people's like romantic lives are built around that, right? I want a partner who knows what he's doing in the next 5 years, kind of thing, right? Like, oh my God, I don't even know what I'm doing in the next 5 days. So I just want to say that, I mean, there will be people who will plan and who are good at that. But if you are not that sort, then you don't have to go down that route, and you can continue dreaming, and because I think this whole idea of allowing your mind to stray, you will, I think, sometimes stumble into really interesting things, and things that I think you would not encounter if you had planned things, So I think the thing about planning is actually you're limiting yourself to a whole wide range of like encounters and experiences. Out there. And also sometimes I feel like it's not really us making decisions. Sometimes I might sound like I'm encouraging this kind of passive drifting through life kind of thing, but I do say at the same time that I'm a person who's very comfortable with chaos. I don't reject it. I think life is messy. I think it's sometimes the products of chance encounters, serendipity, and we must always open ourselves up to those, right?
And celebrate this glorious mess too.
Exactly, right? Yes. So I think I know there's a kiasu culture. There's the whole if I don't plan things properly, I invite accidents and all that. But not all accidents are bad. Yeah. There are happy accidents out there waiting for you.
And they are never accidents. Because when you look back, they were not.
Right.
It's just that you didn't plan it, but life had planned it.
Life had plans for you.
Yeah,
exactly.
Right?
That's beautiful. Yeah. So, if you... you don't have to plan so hard because life has plans for you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Alfian, that was so beautiful. I really enjoyed this. We could really go on and on and on, but we'll stop. Okay, so the wrap up for me, two things I felt, was that I felt like what we have been discussing is how we define success really also define ourselves. Right. So it's really important what we choose to define as success. In other words, if we choose to define success this way, it's going to be what we become.
Yes.
As a person. So that's the first thing that came to me. The second thing that came to me, because the whole idea was also to talk about arts for this conversation. I really think that arts is really such a way to our hearts.
Yes.
Right? But it doesn't mean that it's only to the hearts. I mean, I'm sure you are all brilliant in your heads as well. But I'm saying that, I think that's what's come for me. This conversation is so much about the heart as well. So as always, at the end of the conversation, we try to share some resources, and it's very clear that today, obviously, we will be sharing resources, for our listeners out there to come forward, support, find out more about local arts. So obviously, we all know Alfian is with the WildRice company, but there are also other local theatre companies like Theatre Works, and there's actually currently a work called No Ordinary.
It's a festival.
It's a festival, called NOW, No Ordinary Work. There's of course the Necessary Stage, which you started your career with.
I did.
Yes, you did. With Alvin and Harish.
That's right.
There are obviously also community art groups out there we should support, like Drama Box.
There's a Malay theatre company called Theatre Ikan Matra also.
That's right. That's
really exciting work.
Very exciting work. I agree. And don't forget, obviously, our friends, our local publishers, Ethos Books and Epigram. They put out really good works, local works as well. So that's really important. All right, so I will leave you, as always, with an invitation. How do you define success? What is the story you are writing for yourself?